"Sir, that boy lived with me in the orphanage." The sentence was barely louder than the violin music drifting through the ballroom, yet it sliced through the room with the force of shattered glass. Claire Whitmore stood frozen beside a silver tray of champagne flutes as hundreds of wealthy guests slowly turned toward her. At the center of the stage, beneath a ceiling dripping with crystal chandeliers, billionaire Edward Grayson tightened his grip on the young boy's shoulder. For one impossible second, the entire room stopped breathing. The Grand Marquette ballroom glowed like a palace carved from light itself. Golden reflections shimmered across polished marble floors. Towering floral arrangements filled the air with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. Waiters in white gloves moved silently between tables where senators, CEOs, and television personalities laughed beneath soft amber lighting. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered against the dark spring sky like another universe entirely. Claire had spent the last 3 hours trying not to be noticed. That was the first rule her mother taught her whenever they worked events like this one. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. People like us survive by blending into the background. Her mother, Diane Whitmore, moved carefully through the crowd carrying a tray of sparkling water, her black service uniform pressed perfectly despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Diane had worked double shifts for nearly 6 years cleaning luxury apartments and serving private events for people whose watches cost more than her yearly salary. Tonight mattered more than most jobs. Edward Grayson himself was hosting the gala. The Edward Grayson Foundation had become famous across America for helping orphan children find homes. Cameras lined the ballroom. Reporters crowded near the stage. Everyone wanted footage of the billionaire introducing the boy he planned to adopt. Claire had tried not to pay attention at first. She really had. But then she saw the photograph appear on the giant LED screen hanging above the ballroom. Edward Grayson stood smiling beside a thin blonde boy wearing a navy suit 2 sizes too large for him. Beneath the image glowed 4 elegant words. A new beginning. Claire's fingers suddenly went numb around the silver tray. The room blurred. The violin music faded beneath the pounding of her heartbeat. Because she knew that face. Not from television. Not from newspapers. From somewhere colder. Smaller. Sadder. St. Martha's Home for Children. Liam Parker, 12 years old. Bed number 14 beside the cracked radiator near the laundry room. Claire remembered everything all at once. The smell of bleach in the orphanage hallways. The flickering lights over the cafeteria tables. The nights Liam used to sit beside the chapel window tracing clouds on the glass because he could never sleep during thunderstorms. She remembered the tiny scar behind his left ear after he fell near the playground fence one winter. And she remembered the night he disappeared. One moment he was there. The next morning his bed was empty. No goodbye. No explanation. Just whispers from frightened staff members and missing paperwork that vanished overnight. Claire felt the tray slipping from her trembling hands. A champagne glass struck the marble floor and shattered with a sharp crack that echoed through the ballroom. Conversation stopped instantly. Heads turned. Diane's face drained of color from across the room. Claire stared directly at the boy on stage. Liam looked older now. Healthier. But his eyes were exactly the same. Quiet blue eyes carrying the kind of sadness children were never supposed to learn. Edward Grayson frowned as security glanced toward Claire. "Is there a problem?" One of the event managers snapped softly. Claire barely heard him. Her entire body felt cold. Liam finally looked up from the stage lights and saw her standing there. The color disappeared from his face. His lips parted slightly in shock. And that was when Claire realized something even more terrifying. He remembered her too. The silence inside the ballroom became unbearable. It spread slowly beneath the chandeliers like cold water flooding a room. Claire Whitmore could hear nothing except the uneven rhythm of her own breathing and the faint trembling of crystal glasses in her hands. Across the stage, Liam Parker stared at her as though he had seen a ghost walk out of his childhood. Edward Grayson noticed it immediately. Billionaire survived by reading rooms faster than everyone else. And in that instant, he saw something no speechwriter or camera crew could explain. Fear. Not in Claire. In the boy standing beside him. Edward slowly removed his hand from Liam's shoulder. The cameras continued flashing, but now the smiles around the ballroom had started to fade into confusion. Several guests leaned toward each other whispering behind diamond-covered fingers. A television anchor lowered her microphone. Near the stage, One of the foundation board members forced a stiff laugh into the silence. "I am sure there is some misunderstanding," she said quickly. "The girl probably recognizes him from television." But Claire could not stop staring at Liam. The years between them suddenly felt thin as paper. She remembered winter mornings at St. Martha's when the heat stopped working and all the children slept wearing coats beneath rough gray blankets. Liam used to sit beside the radiator pretending it was warm even when frost crept across the windows. He always tried to make the younger children laugh. He would fold paper birds from old church bulletins and toss them across the cafeteria tables while the nuns were not looking. Claire remembered one rainy afternoon when Liam gave away his only dessert because another boy had not eaten all day. Children in places like St. Martha's learned very quickly that kindness was expensive. Yet somehow Liam still found ways to give it away. "Claire," her mother's frightened voice finally broke through the silence. Diane Whitmore hurried toward her daughter with panic written across her exhausted face. "Sweetheart, stop talking." Her hands trembled as she grabbed Claire's arm gently but firmly. Diane already knew how nights like this ended for people like them. Wealthy people did not enjoy surprises, especially public ones. "I am so sorry, Mr. Grayson," Diane said quickly toward the stage. My daughter did not mean to interrupt. Security guards had already started moving closer through the crowd. Their polished shoes clicked softly across the marble floor. Claire saw the fear in her mother's eyes and almost stepped back. Almost. But then Liam spoke. "Claire." His voice cracked quietly into the ballroom. Every guest froze again. Edward Grayson slowly turned toward the boy beside him. "You know her?" he asked. Liam swallowed hard. His fingers tightened around the edge of his navy jacket. For a moment, he looked very small standing beneath the giant television screens and camera lights. Not like the smiling child from the foundation advertisements. Not like the symbol of hope standing beside one of the richest men in America. He looked like a frightened orphan again. "She lived at St. Martha's," Liam whispered. The room shifted instantly. Claire could almost feel it happening. The wealthy guests who had looked through her moments ago were suddenly studying her face carefully. The event managers stopped signaling security forward. Even the reporters straightened with sudden interest. Edward Grayson's expression changed in a way that was almost invisible unless someone watched carefully. His jaw tightened slightly. The color beneath his eyes faded. "St. Martha's?" he repeated slowly. Claire noticed something then. Something strange. Edward Grayson was not reacting like a man hearing random information. He was reacting like someone hearing the return of a problem he thought had disappeared years ago. Liam lowered his eyes toward the marble floor. "I thought she was gone," he admitted softly. Claire felt a chill run through her chest. Because those were not the words of someone surprised to see an old friend. Those were the words of someone who had been told she would never appear again. The warmth disappeared from the ballroom after those words. People still stood beneath golden chandeliers holding glasses filled with $1,000 wine. But now the room felt colder than the orphanage Claire remembered as a child. Edward Grayson stepped down slowly from the stage, his polished shoes crossing the marble floor with measured calm. Yet something in his face had changed completely. The billionaire who had smiled confidently for cameras only minutes earlier now looked like a man walking toward a memory he never wanted to see again. Claire felt her mother gripping her arm tighter. Diane Whitmore's fingers trembled against her sleeve. "Please stop talking," she whispered desperately. "These people can ruin us." Claire understood the fear in her mother's voice. Fear had shaped most of their lives. Fear of losing jobs. Fear of eviction notices. Fear of saying the wrong thing around powerful people who treated workers like furniture. But Claire also knew something else now. Liam was afraid too. She could see it in the way he stood near the stage avoiding everyone's eyes. His shoulders had become rigid beneath the expensive navy suit. The cameras flashing around him no longer looked glamorous. They looked like lightning surrounding a frightened child. Edward stopped only a few feet away from Claire. Up close, he looked older than he did on magazine covers. The silver at his temples seemed sharper beneath the ballroom lights. Tiny lines of exhaustion sat beneath his eyes like cracks in glass. He studied Claire carefully, not with arrogance, but with calculation. "How long were you at St. Martha's?" he asked quietly. The crowd leaned closer. Claire swallowed hard. "Almost 6 years," she answered. "My mother worked in the laundry department there after my father died." Edward's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of St. Martha's. The name itself seemed to carry weight inside him. Around the ballroom, reporters had completely stopped pretending this was still a celebration gala. Phones were raised. Cameras zoomed closer. Somewhere near the back, a woman in diamonds whispered that this was becoming a disaster. But Edward Grayson ignored everyone except Claire and Liam. "And you knew this boy well?" he asked. Claire nodded slowly. Everybody knew Liam. She looked toward the stage where the giant photograph still glowed above them. A new beginning. The words suddenly felt strange now, almost cruel. "He used to help the younger kids when they were scared during storms," Claire said softly. "He hated loud thunder, but he still pretended not to." Liam lowered his head immediately. Claire noticed his fingers trembling against the fabric of his jacket. She remembered that too. Liam always shook when he was nervous. Even as a little boy, he tried to hide it by shoving his hands into his pockets. Edward noticed it as well. Claire saw the billionaire's eyes narrow slightly, as if pieces inside his mind were beginning to connect in ways he did not like. "This is inappropriate," one of the board members interrupted sharply. Harold Benton was a tall man with silver cufflinks and a permanent expression of irritation. He managed several of the Grayson Foundation's financial operations and had spent most of the evening boasting to donors beside the champagne tower. Now sweat glistened faintly along his forehead. "This young woman is clearly confused," he continued quickly. The adoption records were fully verified. Claire noticed something strange then. Liam looked terrified when Harold Benton spoke. Not uncomfortable. Terrified. The boy instinctively stepped backward away from the man. It happened fast. So fast most people missed it. But Claire had spent years surviving by noticing small things. And suddenly she remembered another detail from St. Martha's. The night Liam disappeared, a tall man in an expensive gray coat had arrived after midnight. Claire never saw his face clearly, only his silver cufflinks catching the hallway light as the office door closed. The exact same silver cufflinks Harold Benton wore tonight. Claire felt cold spread through her chest. Because deep down, before she even understood why, she realized this was never just about an adoption. Something had been hidden all those years ago, and the wrong people were starting to panic. The ballroom no longer sounded like a charity gala. The elegant music still drifted softly beneath the chandeliers, but now it mixed with uneasy whispers and nervous laughter that rose and fell like distant waves. Wealthy donors who had arrived expecting a glamorous evening suddenly found themselves trapped inside a story no public relations team could control. Claire Whitmore stood motionless beside the broken champagne glass, still glittering across the marble floor like scattered ice. She could feel every eye in the room moving between her, Liam Parker, and Harold Benton. Harold adjusted his expensive cufflinks again. Too quickly, too often. Tiny details most people ignored became impossible for Claire to overlook now. The silver reflected the ballroom lights exactly the way they had reflected the dim hallway lamps at St. Martha's years ago. Memory returned to her in sharp fragments. The orphanage had always smelled faintly of bleach, candle wax, and old radiator pipes. During winter storms, cold air slipped beneath the windows so badly that children slept wearing socks on their hands. St. Martha's was not cruel, but it was forgotten. Forgotten places always became dangerous eventually. Claire remembered lying awake one snowy night hearing voices downstairs long after lights out. Adult voices. Tense voices. She had slipped quietly into the hallway barefoot, careful to avoid the creaking floorboard Sister Agnes always warned them about. That was when she saw the black car parked outside the orphanage entrance. Its headlights cut through the falling snow like white knives. Two men stood near the office doorway speaking in low voices. One wore a long gray coat. Silver cufflinks flashed beneath his sleeves. Claire could still hear the nervous edge in Sister Agnes's voice. "The boy deserves to know where he is going," the nun whispered. "That is not your concern anymore," the man replied coldly. Claire never forgot those words because they frightened her more than shouting would have. Calm voices in places like St. Martha's usually meant decisions had already been made. She remembered peeking through the stair railing and seeing Liam standing beside the office door, clutching his small backpack. He looked terrified. His eyes searched the hallway as though hoping someone would stop what was happening. When Liam spotted Claire hiding upstairs, he pressed something quickly into the loose vent beneath the chapel staircase before the men escorted him outside. Then he disappeared into the snow forever. Claire had never told anyone what she saw. Children from orphanages learned early that adults rarely listened to them unless they were causing trouble. And trouble had consequences. Claire, Edward Grayson's voice pulled her back into the ballroom. He watched her carefully now, no longer distracted by reporters or donors. What are you thinking about? Before Claire could answer, Harold Benton stepped forward quickly. This has gone far enough, he snapped. His polished smile had vanished completely. Mr. Grayson, the press does not need to witness some emotional misunderstanding from an event worker. Event worker? Not her name. Not a person. Just another invisible servant in a ballroom full of powerful people. Diane lowered her eyes immediately, humiliation washing across her tired face. Claire felt anger rise inside her chest. Not loud anger. The quiet kind built over years of watching wealthy people dismiss human beings with a single sentence. But before she spoke, Liam suddenly looked directly at her. His pale face tightened with panic. The vent, he whispered. Claire froze. Edward noticed instantly. What vent? He asked sharply. Liam swallowed hard, his voice barely audible now. Under the chapel stairs. Harold Benton's expression changed so suddenly, it almost looked painful. The color drained from his face beneath the ballroom lights. One of the reporters noticed immediately and lifted her camera closer. Edward slowly turned toward Harold. Why would a child remember a vent under the chapel stairs? He asked quietly. Nobody answered. The ballroom had become perfectly silent again except for the faint hum of cameras and the distant sound of rain beginning to strike the windows high above Manhattan. Then Claire realized something terrifying. Whatever Liam hid beneath those stairs years ago was important enough to make powerful men afraid. Rain rolled softly down the towering ballroom windows, blurring the Manhattan skyline into streaks of silver and gold. Inside the Grand Marquette, nobody cared about the city anymore. Every ounce of attention had narrowed onto one invisible thread connecting a frightened orphan boy, a billionaire philanthropist, and the maid's daughter standing beside shattered champagne glasses on the marble floor. Edward Grayson's expression remained calm, but the silence around him had become dangerous. Men like Edward did not build billion-dollar empires by ignoring fear in a room. And right now, fear was spreading faster than gossip ever could. Harold Benton forced a stiff smile that looked painfully unnatural beneath the chandeliers. Surely we are not entertaining childhood fantasies now, he said with a dry laugh. Children hide toys everywhere. That hardly means anything. But nobody laughed with him. Not anymore. Liam Parker stood perfectly still beside the stage, his face pale beneath the ballroom lights. Claire could see the panic in his eyes growing stronger every second. She remembered that look too. Liam always looked like that right before thunderstorms hit St. Martha's, like someone waiting for the world to collapse around him. Edward slowly turned back toward the boy. Liam, he said quietly, what was hidden under those stairs? The question seemed simple, yet the entire room leaned closer to hear the answer. Liam opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat tightened visibly. Claire suddenly understood why. Because children from places like St. Martha's survived by keeping secrets. Secrets about hunger. Secrets about fear. Secrets about adults who made promises that never felt safe. He is overwhelmed, Harold interrupted quickly. This entire scene is inappropriate for a child. Edward's eyes moved toward Harold with slow precision. And yet you seem far more nervous than the child, he replied coldly. The ballroom shifted again. Tiny reactions rippled across wealthy faces. A woman lowered her wine glass halfway to her lips. A reporter quietly stepped closer. Even the musicians near the stage had stopped pretending to play. Claire could hear only the soft rain tapping against the windows and the faint hum of television cameras recording every second. Diane Whitmore looked close to tears now. Claire, she whispered desperately, please come with me. Her voice carried years of exhaustion inside it. Years spent cleaning floors people barely noticed. Years spent apologizing simply for existing in rooms like this one. Claire loved her mother too much to ignore the fear in her eyes. But something deeper held her in place. Because for the first time in her life, powerful people were finally listening. Liam suddenly looked toward Claire again. His hands trembled at his sides. You remember the box? He asked softly. Claire nodded immediately. Memory returned with painful clarity. A small rusted tin box hidden beneath a loose vent under the chapel stairs. The children used to hide tiny treasures there. Drawings. Notes. Candy wrappers saved from holidays. Small things that made abandoned children feel visible. But one night Liam placed something different inside. Claire remembered asking him what it was. Liam had only whispered one sentence before hiding the box away forever. If something happens to me, this proves who I am. Edward Grayson's entire body stiffened. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Claire watched the billionaire's fingers slowly curl into a fist beside his tailored suit. Who told you to say that? Edward asked quietly. Liam lowered his eyes. A woman named Sister Miriam, he whispered. Harold Benton immediately stepped forward. Mr. Grayson, enough. The boy clearly has emotional trauma from institutional care. We should end this spectacle before the press destroys tonight's event. Spectacle. Event. Claire suddenly realized something horrifying. Harold Benton did not sound worried about Liam. He sounded worried about exposure. Edward noticed it too. The billionaire stared at Harold for a long moment without blinking. Then he asked a question so calmly it chilled the entire ballroom. Why did Sister Miriam disappear 6 days after Liam left St. Martha's? Harold's face lost all remaining color. Across the room, several reporters instantly raised their phones higher. Because now the story was no longer about a charity gala. It was beginning to sound like a cover-up. The air inside the ballroom felt heavier now, thick with tension and expensive perfume. Nobody touched their drinks anymore. Crystal chandeliers still glittered overhead, casting warm gold across marble floors and silk gowns. But the illusion of elegance had cracked wide open. The wealthy guests who arrived expecting a polished charity event now stood trapped inside a mystery unfolding in real time. Edward Grayson remained perfectly still near the center of the room, but Claire Whitmore noticed the subtle changes in him. The billionaire's calm had become sharp, dangerous. His eyes no longer carried the practiced warmth of a public figure posing for cameras. They carried the cold focus of a man hunting for the truth. Harold Benton shifted uneasily beneath that stare. Tiny beads of sweat gathered near his temples despite the cool ballroom air. Sister Miriam retired years ago, Harold said quickly. I fail to see what any of this has to do with tonight. Edward did not look away from him. You funded St. Martha's through the Grayson Foundation for almost a decade, he replied. You personally reviewed transfer records involving orphan placements. Harold forced another smile. Thousands of records, Edward. You cannot expect me to remember every child. But Liam flinched the instant Harold said the word child. Claire noticed it immediately. So did Edward. The billionaire turned slowly toward Liam, his voice softer now. Did Harold ever visit St. Martha's while you lived there? Liam hesitated. Fear crossed his face like a shadow passing over sunlight. Claire suddenly remembered another detail from years ago. Harold Benton carrying expensive boxes into the orphanage office every Christmas while cameras followed behind him. The newspapers called him generous. The children called him the man with silver hands because of his cufflinks. Liam finally nodded once. He came at night sometimes, the boy whispered. A murmur swept across the ballroom. Reporters scribbled notes frantically now. Phones remained lifted high, recording every second. Harold's voice rose sharply. This is absurd. The boy clearly has confused memories. But Liam looked directly at him for the first time all evening. You told Sister Miriam not to let anyone see my file, he said quietly. Harold's entire body stiffened. Claire felt the room freeze around them. Somewhere in the ballroom, a woman gasped softly. Edward's face hardened. What file? He asked. Liam swallowed hard. The one with my real name. Silence crashed down again. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now. Claire saw Edward Grayson's fingers tighten slowly at his side. Liam Parker is not your real name. Edward asked carefully. Liam shook his head once. That is the name they gave me after I came to St. Martha's. Harold stepped forward immediately. Edward, enough. You are interrogating a frightened child in front of the press. But Edward suddenly snapped. Not loudly, quietly, which was somehow worse. Do not tell me what I am doing in my own foundation. The room fell completely still. Claire saw genuine fear flash across Harold Benton's face for the first time. Not embarrassment, not irritation, fear. Edward turned back toward Liam. What was your name before St. Martha's? Liam's lips parted, but his eyes filled with uncertainty, like someone who had spent years trying to forget a memory too painful to carry. Claire remembered nights at the orphanage when Liam woke up crying from dreams he could never explain. He used to whisper one word over and over in his sleep. Grayson. At the time, Claire thought it was meaningless. Now her chest tightened with realization. Liam finally spoke so softly the ballroom almost missed it. "Lucas," he whispered. Edward Grayson went completely pale. The color drained from his face beneath the chandelier light so suddenly that even the reporters noticed. Claire watched his breathing stop for half a second. One impossible second where the billionaire no longer looked powerful. He looked shattered. Then Edward whispered something that made the room feel colder than St. Martha's ever had. "Lucas was my nephew." The words hit the ballroom harder than any scream could have. Lucas was my nephew. For one frozen moment, nobody moved beneath the glittering chandeliers. Wealthy donors stood motionless with pale faces and untouched wine glasses. Reporters forgot to blink. Even the rain against the tall windows seemed distant now, swallowed by the unbearable silence spreading through the grand Marquette ballroom. Claire Whitmore stared at Edward Grayson in disbelief. The billionaire's face had completely changed. The confident philanthropist from magazine covers was gone. In his place stood a man unraveling in front of hundreds of witnesses. Edward's eyes remained fixed on Liam as though he were staring directly into the ruins of his own past. "That is impossible," Harold Benton said sharply. His voice cracked slightly despite his effort to sound composed. "Lucas Grayson died 11 years ago." Edward turned toward him slowly. Too slowly. "No," Edward replied in a dangerously quiet voice. "That is what someone wanted us to believe." The room erupted into whispers. Cameras flashed brighter now. One reporter near the stage was already speaking urgently into her phone, while another whispered to a producer that this story was about to explode nationwide. Claire could feel the atmosphere shifting completely. Minutes ago, these people looked at her like she was invisible. Now every eye followed her, as if she held the final page of a secret nobody wealthy enough had been able to buy. Liam looked overwhelmed by the attention surrounding him. His breathing became uneven. Claire remembered how crowded rooms always frightened him at St. Martha's. He used to hide inside the chapel whenever donors visited the orphanage because he hated strangers staring at him like a sad advertisement. Instinctively, Claire stepped closer to him. The movement was small, but Edward noticed immediately. So did Liam. The boy looked at Claire with visible relief, like seeing the only familiar face left in a collapsing world. Edward's expression softened for half a second as he watched them. Then his focus returned to Harold Benton. "Explain this," Edward demanded. Harold straightened his expensive suit jacket with trembling hands. "There is nothing to explain," he snapped. "Your brother's son died in the boating accident exactly as authorities confirmed years ago." Edward's jaw tightened instantly at the mention of his brother. Claire noticed pain flash across his face before disappearing again beneath control. "My brother and his wife died," Edward corrected coldly. "Lucas's body was never recovered." Another wave of whispers moved through the ballroom. Claire suddenly understood why Edward looked haunted. For 11 years, an entire family had mourned a child they believed lost forever, while that child spent his life inside orphanages under another name. Harold's voice became desperate now. "Edward, think carefully before humiliating your foundation over emotional speculation from traumatized children." But Edward no longer looked interested in protecting reputations. He looked furious, quietly furious, the kind of anger powerful men carried like ice instead of fire. "You handled every legal transfer involving St. Martha's during that period," Edward said. "You signed the closure paperwork when the orphanage shut down." Harold swallowed hard. Claire noticed sweat running along his collar, now despite the cool ballroom air. Liam suddenly spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sister Miriam told me never to trust the people who changed my name." Edward's eyes widened slightly. "Did she say who changed it?" Liam hesitated. Fear crossed his face again. Then slowly, shakily, he raised his hand and pointed directly at Harold Benton. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Harold stepped backward immediately. "This is insanity," he shouted. He was a frightened child. He remembers nothing correctly. Claire's heart pounded violently now because she remembered something too. The hidden tin box beneath the chapel stairs. The one Liam said proved who he really was. "The box," Claire whispered suddenly. Edward turned toward her immediately. What was inside it? Claire tried to steady her breathing. "I never opened it," she admitted. "But Liam told me it had papers. And a photograph." Liam nodded slowly. "A family photograph," he whispered. Edward Grayson closed his eyes for one brief moment, as if the room itself had tilted beneath him. When he opened them again, his voice was colder than the rain hammering against the Manhattan skyline outside. "Get me a car," he ordered his security team. "Tonight we are going to St. Martha's." The convoy of black SUVs cut through the rainy Manhattan streets just after midnight. Red brake lights shimmered across wet pavement while thunder rolled low above the city skyline. Inside the lead vehicle, nobody spoke. Edward Grayson sat beside Liam Parker in complete silence, his face pale beneath the passing streetlights. Across from them, Claire Whitmore held her mother's trembling hand tightly. Diane still looked overwhelmed, as though she could not understand how a normal catering shift had turned into something that felt ripped from a nightmare. Claire barely understood it herself. St. Martha's sat nearly 40 miles outside the city, hidden beyond old highways and dark pine trees. By the time the convoy reached the abandoned orphanage, the rain had become heavier, drumming against the cracked roof and broken windows like impatient fingers. The building looked smaller than Claire remembered. Sadder too. Time had stripped away what little warmth the orphanage once held. Paint peeled from the walls. Ivy crawled across stone archways. One of the chapel windows had shattered completely, leaving black emptiness where colored glass once glowed during Sunday mornings. Edward stepped out into the cold rain first. Expensive leather shoes splashed into muddy puddles without hesitation. The billionaire stared at the orphanage for a long moment, and Claire saw something strange in his expression. Guilt. Deep and crushing guilt. "I donated millions here," Edward said quietly. "I thought children were being protected." No one answered, because everyone standing there understood the terrible truth hidden beneath his words. Money could build buildings. It could buy advertisements and smiling press conferences. But it could not guarantee kindness behind closed doors. Flashlights cut through the darkness as security opened the rusted chapel doors. The smell inside hit Claire instantly. Dust. Old wood. Rainwater soaked into forgotten carpets. And beneath it all, the faint lingering scent of candle wax she remembered from childhood prayers whispered by children who had nobody else left to ask for help. Liam froze near the entrance. Fear tightened across his face as old memories returned around him. Claire gently touched his arm. "It is okay," she whispered softly. He nodded once, though his hands still shook. Together they walked toward the staircase beside the chapel wall. Claire's heart pounded harder with every step. The loose vent beneath the stairs was still there exactly where she remembered. Rust covered the edges now. Dirt and cobwebs filled the corners. For 11 years, whatever Liam hid inside had remained untouched. Edward knelt slowly beside the vent despite the rainwater soaking into his tailored coat. Claire noticed his hands trembling slightly as he pulled at the metal cover. Harold Benton stood farther back beneath a flashlight beam surrounded by security guards. His face looked hollow now. The confidence that once filled the ballroom had vanished completely. "Edward," Harold said nervously, "please think carefully before turning old fantasies into public scandal." Edward ignored him completely. The vent finally groaned open with a sharp metallic sound. Dust drifted into the flashlight beams. And there it was. A small rusted tin box tucked deep beneath the stairs exactly where Liam left it all those years ago. Nobody moved. Claire could hear only rain striking the roof and Liam's uneven breathing beside her. Edward lifted the box slowly like it might break apart in his hands. The metal lid resisted at first before finally opening with a faint crack. Inside rested a folded photograph wrapped carefully inside plastic and several yellow documents tied with faded blue string. Edward unfolded the photograph first. The second he saw it, the billionaire's face collapsed completely. Claire looked over his shoulder and saw a younger Edward Grayson smiling beside his brother and sister-in-law on a sunny beach. Between them stood a little blonde boy no older than 5 years old. Liam, or rather, Lucas Grayson. Tears filled Edward's eyes instantly. Real tears. Uncontrolled tears from a man who had spent years believing his nephew died at sea. Then Claire noticed another paper sliding loose from the box. A legal document stamped with the Grayson Foundation seal. At the bottom sat one unmistakable signature. Harold Benton. Rain continued falling over St. Martha's long after the truth finally surfaced. Water streamed down cracked chapel windows while flashlights illuminated the dusty room where forgotten secrets had slept for more than a decade. Edward Grayson remained kneeling beside the open tin box, the old family photograph trembling in his hands. Claire Whitmore had never seen a powerful man look so completely broken. Not because of money, not because of scandal, because of regret. Deep, unbearable regret. Lucas Grayson stood frozen beside him, staring at the photograph of the family he barely remembered. The little boy smiling in the picture felt like someone else now. Someone who belonged to another life before orphanage hallways and lonely winters erased his name. Edward slowly looked up at him, eyes filled with tears reflecting the flashlight beams. "Lucas," he whispered shakily, as though speaking the name aloud after 11 years hurt his soul. The boy swallowed hard. "Nobody has called me that in a very long time." Claire felt her chest tighten painfully at those words. Because children did not forget their names by accident. They forgot them when the world convinced them they no longer mattered. Behind them, Harold Benton looked ready to collapse. Security guards stood on either side of him now, while reporters waiting outside the chapel doors captured every moment unfolding inside. The carefully polished image Harold spent years building had dissolved in a single night beneath rainwater and truth. Edward unfolded the remaining documents with trembling fingers. Legal transfer forms, financial records, confidential agreements connected to St. Martha's. Claire did not understand every page, but one thing became painfully clear. Harold Benton had hidden Lucas Grayson after the boating accident because the child's inheritance rights threatened a business merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars years earlier. A missing heir had been more convenient than a living one. Edward closed his eyes tightly for one long moment. The rain hammered against the chapel roof above them, while guilt settled across his face like a physical weight. "All these years," he said quietly, "he was alone." Lucas lowered his head. "Not completely," he whispered. Then slowly, he looked toward Claire. Edward followed his gaze. For the first time that night, the billionaire truly saw the girl standing beside the broken chapel stairs. Not as staff, not as background, not as somebody invisible carrying silver trays through expensive ballrooms. He saw the person who protected his nephew when nobody else did. Claire suddenly felt embarrassed beneath that attention. Her shoes were wet. Her catering uniform smelled like rain and dust. She still looked exactly like what wealthy people expected her to be. Small, forgettable. But Edward Grayson stepped toward her anyway. "You remembered him," he said softly. Claire nodded once. "He used to be scared during thunderstorms," she answered quietly. "I could not forget him." Edward's expression cracked again with emotion. "The entire world forgot him," he whispered. "Except you." Diane Whitmore stood silently near the chapel entrance, tears running down her tired face. For years she believed surviving meant staying invisible, keeping her head down, never questioning powerful people. Yet tonight, her daughter's courage had uncovered the truth that millions of dollars and private investigators never found. Outside, police sirens echoed faintly through the rain as more vehicles arrived at St. Martha's. Harold Benton lowered his head the moment officers stepped inside the chapel. He no longer looked powerful, just hollow, like a man finally standing in front of consequences too heavy to escape. 6 months later, St. Martha's no longer stood abandoned beneath broken windows and leaking ceilings. Construction crews rebuilt the property into the Grayson Children's Center, a place designed to help foster children find permanent homes with safety, education, and dignity. Claire received a full scholarship to Columbia University paid personally by Edward Grayson, though she almost refused it at first because she still was not used to people offering kindness without conditions. Diane became director of family outreach at the new center, and Lucas Grayson finally moved into the family home that should have been his all along. Yet the moment Claire remembered most happened quietly one autumn afternoon. No cameras, no reporters, just falling leaves drifting across the courtyard outside the rebuilt chapel. Lucas sat beside her on a wooden bench watching children laugh near the playground. For the first time since she had known him, he looked peaceful. Then softly, almost uncertainly, he asked a question that made Claire's eyes fill with tears. "Do you think this place finally feels like home?" Claire looked at the children running through sunlight where loneliness once lived and smiled gently. "Yes," she whispered. "I think it finally does."